The first Japanese air fleet, also known as Kido Butai, which means Mobile Strike Force, was Japan's major carrier battle group, and it comprised a majority of the carriers that were deployed in the Pacific theater for the first 8 months of World War II. Now, the title Kido Butai was used in day-to-day operations, and it was never an official designation. Now, the British Royal Navy had established its own air branch in 1912, before World War I, and sensing the increasing importance of aircraft in naval warfare, the Imperial Japanese Navy founded its air service a year later. In 1913, the IJN seaplane carrier Wakamiya was converted into a seaplane tender that carried aircraft on board. On the 5th of September of 1914, Japan launched the world's first successful naval air raid from Jiaozhou Bay off Qingdao. A day later, a seaplane attacked the Kaiser and Elizabeth and the German gunboat Jaguar with bombs. And while unsuccessful, Japan had fought the very first air-sea battle in history. Now, during World War I, the Imperial Japanese Navy learned to combine air groups together for carrier divisions, rather than from individual carriers. And this allowed them to concentrate their attacks, particularly when they were attacking onshore targets. Japan would continue to use this form of massed air assault from a concentration of carriers throughout the war. Now, the fatal flaw to this doctrine was that the relatively tight formation of carriers, usually arrayed in a diamond pattern, with ships about 7 kilometers apart, was vulnerable to counterstrikes. While Japan led the world in naval air tactics, they also suffered with several issues. The shipboard anti-aircraft systems were inferior, and their lack of earlier warning systems, as well as radar, left them at a disadvantage for gathering intelligence on enemy positions. They were also hampered by a shortage of combat aircraft to protect their bombers. Formed on the 10th of April of 1941, the first air fleet was a naval battle group with the single most powerful concentration of carrier-based aircraft in the entire world. Its first carrier division consisted of the carriers Akagi and Kaga, its second of the Soryu, Hiryu, and a destroyer unit, and the third of the light carrier Rujo. 5 months later, the carriers Zuikaku, Shikaku, and Kasugamaru were added, and in December, the light carrier Shoho was added. Now, functionally, the Kido Butai consisted of 6 carriers, 414 airplanes, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 8 tankers, 23 submarines, and 4 midget subs. And for a time, it was the most powerful naval fleet in the world. Now, the number and type of aircraft attached to each carrier varied by the capacity of the carrier, and usually it was from 24 to up to 80 aircraft per ship. Now, the large carriers had fighters, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers, while the smaller carriers usually had only fighters and torpedo bombers. On the 26th of November of 1941, under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the Kido Butai set out from Japan towards Hawaii. And early on the morning of the 7th of December, they launched a surprise attack on the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor. By the end of the day, 21 American ships were either sunk or incapacitated, 188 American aircraft were destroyed, and 2,500 American soldiers and sailors lay dead. Of course, the next day, the U.S. declared war on Japan. Now, 2 months later, the Kido Butai launched a similar raid on Darwin in Australia's North Territory. And after a short raid on the lightly defended city, a number of Australian vessels lay at the bottom of the harbor, and several hundred Australians were killed. The Japanese fleet then turned its attention to the Indian Ocean for several months, inflicting heavy casualties on the British fleet and attacking Ceylon. In May, Nagumo decided to raid Port Moresby in New Guinea. At the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 7th and 8th, the American aircraft were able to sink the carrier Shoho and drive the Japanese forces away. Now, in the fierce fighting that occurred during the battle, the USS Lexington was sunk and the Yorktown was badly damaged. And at the same time, the Shikaku was badly damaged. Japan's Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's next plan was to lure the U.S. Navy carriers out and destroy them near Midway Island. And on the 4th of June, the IJN attacked Midway. However, the U.S. had decoded the Japanese plans for the battle, and they were ready for the attack. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were destroyed, and the Hiryu was badly crippled. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi was able to launch an airstrike that disabled the Yorktown, which was later sunk, but in a single day, the Kido Butai had lost 4 more of their carriers, as well as most of their experienced air crews. The force moved back to Japan to regroup, and in July of 1943, the first air fleet was recreated as a land-based air fleet with the plan to base the aircraft on Pacific Islands, which would now serve as a kind of unsinkable aircraft carrier. Now, the unit did participate in the Battle of the Philippines. However, it was now functioning only as a ghost of its former self. And with only 41 aircraft and mostly inexperienced pilots, the only viable tactic they had was to make kamikaze attacks. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 44, the last remnants of the Kido Butai were used as a decoy force. Then during the battle, the carriers Zawikaku, Zuiho, Chiyoda, and Chitose were sunk by air attacks. Japan's naval dominance of the Pacific Ocean was officially over. Okay, this week's game is Kido Butai, Japan's Carriers at Midway. It was published in 2016 by Dr. Richter Conflict Simulation, and its designer was Benjamin Richter. Kind of a hard game to find. I had to find one on eBay, but it's an interesting game, and I thought I'd kind of show you the vassal module a little bit to give you guys an idea what it's about. Now, it's a solitaire game where you represent Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, and you're confronted with some of the major decisions that he made on June 4th of 1942. So to set the game up, you put the 4 Japanese carriers with their higher number sides showing onto the corresponding boxes on the map. Next, you put the 0 squadrons on each carrier, and the 3 bomber squadrons each on Akagi and Kaga, and 2 bomber squadrons on Soryu and Hiryu. Each bomber squadron can be flipped to its bomb or torpedo side as desired while it's on the carrier, and all squadrons are placed with the lettering on the top, which indicates that they're ready to fly. Next, you put the Midway counter with its higher number side showing onto the corresponding box on the map, and then throw the 3 American carriers into an opaque container, such as a coffee cup, to create the American fleet pool. Now, the carrier dummy, which reads no carriers, is then set aside. Next, you place the American bomber squadrons and the bomber dummies, which say no bomber, into an opaque container to create the U.S. bomber pool. Finally, throw the American Buffalo squadrons together with their dummies, which say no fighter, into a third opaque container to create the American fighter pool. Finally, you set the turn marker at 0430 hours, and you are ready to go. Kido Butai is played in a series of up to 16 turns, each representing 1 hour of real time. And a turn consists of 3 phases that have to be completed in the following order. First, there's a Japanese phase, then there's a mutual reconnaissance phase where each side's looking for the other, and finally there's an American phase where the Americans can try to bomb the Japanese carriers. So let's go through them in detail. Probably the main phase of the game is the Japanese phase. In this phase, you, as Admiral Nagumi, perform the following actions, and you can do this in any desired order. You can launch air squadrons that are ready for action from the decks of the Japanese carriers in order to attack enemy targets or to protect your own carriers. And there are 2 types of air squadrons. There's bomber squadrons, which are placed in the center of the map after launch, and combat air patrols, or cap squadrons, which are made up solely of fighter aircraft, and these shield the Japanese carriers from American bombers. Now, the cap aircraft are placed onto the cap box. Now, the bombers are placed in the center of the map, indicating they're flying off to their target, and at the end of placing all these, you turn them 1 turn clockwise. Next, you can attack with squadrons that have reached their target, and after the attack, I place them on the center right side of the map and rotate these clockwise to face downwards, indicating that they've attacked and are now returning. Now, the squadrons facing downwards at the beginning of a turn have to land, and if they're unable to do so, they're destroyed. And landing simply involves placing them back on the carriers. Now, once these squadrons have landed, they're pointed to the left. And finally, you can ready squadrons aboard the carriers for action by rotating them clockwise and facing them upwards again. And during this action, bomber squadrons can be flipped from their bomb to their torpedo side, or vice versa. And now the squadrons are ready to launch again. Now, squadrons in the cap box also have to be rotated clockwise by 90 degrees each turn. And while you can engage in multiple actions in a turn, each squadron can only perform 1 action. And while each carrier can either launch or land squadrons, they can't do both at the same time. Classic example of what happened in the real battle. One other thing to note is that the individual carriers can carry no more squadrons than the number printed on the counter. And this is indicated by damaged ships being flipped to their reduced side. Now, the mutual reconnaissance phase is the phase where both players attempt to find each other. It's pretty simple. You roll a die for the Americans, and on a result of 5 or 6, then they find the Japanese fleet. And once the Kido Butai is found, that roll doesn't need to be made ever again. Next, you roll 1 die for the Japanese. On a result of a 6, the American fleet has been spotted. Now, once both the Japanese and the American fleets have been detected, then the mutual reconnaissance phase is skipped for the rest of the game, unless a Japanese attack on the reported Americans reveals that a second U.S. fleet is around, and we can talk about that in a little bit. In this case, Japanese reconnaissance is resumed in the next mutual reconnaissance phase until that second fleet is found. Finally, there's the American phase, and the American attack on Japanese carriers can't begin until turn 3, though the Americans can still attempt to spot the Kido Butai on turns 1 and 2. Also, the Americans can respond to Japanese attacks on their carriers before turn 3. Now, once the Americans are able to launch attacks, you randomly draw a counter from the U.S. bomber pool. If it's a dummy counter, no attack takes place, and if it's a bomber counter, you continue to draw more counters until a dummy counter is drawn. And all of these drawn bombers immediately attack the Japanese fleet. Now, once it's determined that a U.S. attack is going to occur, you follow the same procedures drawing from the U.S. fighter pool to determine how many, if any, fighters are accompanying these attacking bombers. Now let's go back and talk about combat in the Japanese phase. Once these bombers are in the center of the map, the squadrons break off to either attack Midway or the American fleet. Now note that the American fleet can only be attacked if they've been spotted. Now bombers on their bomb side can only attack Midway, and bombers on their torpedo side can only attack the carriers. And to attack an American fleet, you draw one counter from the U.S. fleet pool. And before drawing a second counter, you throw the no carrier counter that was set aside at the start of the game into the pool. At this point, you draw again to see what other carriers can be attacked. If the no carrier counter is now drawn from that pool, then all the carriers beneath it in the U.S. fleet pool constitute a separate fleet that has to be found and attacked separately. Next, you draw counters from the U.S. fighter pool until you draw a no fighter counter. And if the initial counter drawn is a no fighter counter, then that means there's no fighters that are protecting that target. If a fighter counter is drawn, however, then air combat ensues. You set all the U.S. fighter counters up against all the Japanese aircraft counters. And bombers can't be confronted until all the Japanese Zeros have been confronted. So you place a priority on facing fighters against each other until all Zeros have a counter opposite them. And if there are more Zeros than fighters, then U.S. fighters will have to face the spare Zeros. This basically means that the U.S. fighter would get one attack on a Zero, while the Zeros would get more than one attack on the fighter. Now, once all the Zeros have been accounted for, you replace any remaining U.S. fighters up against the bombers, until all U.S. fighters have been utilized. Now, to resolve the air attack, each fighter, U.S. and Japanese, rolls a die, and Japanese fighters are shot down on a roll of 6, American fighters on a roll of 5 or 6, and bombers from both sides are shot down on a 5 or 6. Also, if you're rolling against a bomber and you get a 3 or 4, then that bomber aborts its mission without dropping its bombs. And these bombers immediately attempt to return to their carriers. After this single round of combat, then the destroyed fighters are removed from play, and any surviving American fighters and no fighter counters that were drawn are placed 3 hours ahead on the game turn track. Now, once the turn track marker reaches them again, then you return them to the American fighter pool. Now, for each American squadron that's shot down, remove one no fighter counter from the game. And if none was drawn, take it from the fighter pool. And if there's none in the fighter pool, take it from the turn track. Now, once the attacking bombers have survived the air combat, they now come under anti-aircraft fire. Determining the effect of anti-aircraft fire is pretty simple. For each group of bombers, you roll a d6, and if the U.S. rolls a 5 or 6, or the Japanese rolls a 6, one of the attacking bombers in the group has to abort their bombing run. Then the remaining bomber squadrons are finally ready to attack the target. Now, there are 2 different ways to roll damage. The first occurs if the bombing units were previously engaged in an air combat phase. Then, in this case, each bomber rolls a die 6, and if they're attacking a carrier, a 5 or 6 hits. If they're attacking Midway, only a 6 hits. And each hit does 1 point of damage, and this is simply represented by turning the Midway or carrier marker over. And note that the number on both sides of these markers indicates how many U.S. squadrons these units can hold, in both their normal and reduced state respectively. However, if an attacking bomber didn't engage in combat air patrol in the previous phase of combat, they come under anti-aircraft fire, and then after resolving this, all non-aborted bombing squadrons roll a die, and the damage to the target is the sum of all of the die rolls. Say, for example, 3 squadrons of bombers arrived unopposed and survived anti-aircraft fire, you'd roll 3 die. And if you rolled a 1, 3, and 6, for example, the target would take 10 points of damage, more than enough to obliterate it. This simply represents the incredible vulnerability of carriers in Midway when they're unprotected by combat air patrols. So the lesson here is to keep those combat air patrols flying. Now, it only takes 2 hits to sink a carrier or destroy the Midway base. Now, as I mentioned before, there's a certain holding capacity that these have for aircraft to return to after their bombing missions. Now, while aircraft can return to any carrier base, they can't return if there are less aircraft slots due to destruction by bombing runs. And in these cases, the aircraft are ditched in the sea and they're eliminated from the game. When you're removing these, always remove whatever category is the more numerous. If there's a tie, just roll a dice. Now, the combat in the American phase is resolved in a very similar fashion to that in the Japanese phase, with a few modifications. Now, once the Americans are approaching the Japanese carriers, you check the Japanese Combat Air Patrol box, and if there are any in flight, you roll 1 die. On a result of 1 to 3, the American bomber run consists of torpedo bombers, and on a 4 through 6 of dive bombers. There's no mixed attack. All attacks are either torpedo or dive bombers, and you can flip them to their corresponding side at this point. Now, in the case of fighting torpedo bombers, surviving Japanese cap squadrons are flipped over to their low cap side for 1 turn. Now, note that if you have more than 1 fighter flying cap, not all of them have to be committed against incoming enemy torpedo bombers. Now, the U.S. bomber squadrons that have passed the Japanese Combat Air Patrol are assigned to the Japanese carriers in the following way. The first squadron attacks the Akagi, the second the Kaga, the third the Soryu, and the fourth the Hiryu. The fifth joins the attack on the Akagi, the sixth then attacks the Kaga, and so on. And squadrons aboard a sunken Japanese carrier are lost. Now, damage to Japanese carriers only reduces the number of squadrons aboard if the latter exceeds the carrier's reduced holding capacity. However, squadrons aboard a sunken Japanese carrier are simply lost. And at the end of the American phase, all surviving American squadrons and dummies are placed back on the game turn track 5 hours ahead. Now, even though this is a solitaire game, you figure victory points for both sides. Now, there are several ways of getting victory points. Every enemy carrier damaged but not sunk at the end of the game is worth 1 victory point. If you sink the Soryu and Hiryu, it's worth 2 victory points. And if you sink the Akagi, Kaga, or an American carrier, it's worth 3 victory points. Also, every enemy squadron destroyed is worth 1/4 of a victory point. And finally, if you destroy the Midway base, it's worth 1 victory point. After you've determined the victory points for both sides, the American victory point total is subtracted from the Japanese total. And a final score of -6 or less is a major Japanese defeat. A -5 to -1 is a minor Japanese defeat. A 0 is a draw. A +1 to +5 is a minor Japanese victory. And a +6 or more is a major Japanese victory. Hey folks, welcome back. This is Kido Butai, and it's a solitaire game in which you take the position of Admiral Nagumo, flying at Midway against the American fleet of carriers, and see if you can send them to the bottom before they do the same to you. I've got the game set up here. I've got the U.S. forces in their 3 cups. There's the fighters, the bombers, and the fleet, and then this little no carrier thing I'm holding out here. Here's our turn marker. I've got it set at 0430, and then I've got the 4 Japanese carriers down here. And they've got their complement of 4, 4, 3, and 3 planes. Everybody's ready to take off down here, and we will start with the Japanese portion of it. Now, the Americans can't fly out for 3 turns, so I really don't need to send a cap out until then. At least until turn 3, I guess I would need to send my first cap out, so that's okay. But I can go ahead and send some vowels. Now, before you fly them out, you need to make a decision whether you want bombers or torpedo bombers, or dive bombers, I guess, or regular bombers. So I'm going to go with vowels since I'm going to be going up against Midway. I think I will have a 0 go with them, just in case. And so they fly off, and that ends my turn. So I rotate these guys, and so they're on their way out. Okay, now we roll dice to see if we can find each other. The U.S. needs a 5 or 6, and they get a 3, so they don't find the Japanese. The Japanese need a 6, and they get it, so they can fly out against the U.S. here next turn. And that's it. I don't think there's anything else that can be done this turn. The U.S. can't do anything because they can't fly against the Japanese here, and they can't protect Midway. So we go to 0530. Okay. Japanese, we'll start with the Japanese, and we will fly them to Midway. All these vowels. At the same time, I think I will have 4, 5, these 6 and a 0 are going to fly now. I'm going to change these all to, whoops. I'm going to change all of these guys to Kate's torpedo bombers when I flew them out. And then 1, 0. And that's all these guys can do. Now we're going to have the attack on Midway. And we got to see if Midway puts up any defense. So we're going to see if any fighters are there. And there's a Buffalo. And there's no fighter. Okay, so we can put this ahead. 1, 2, 3. These are fighting close by. They're not making a fight clear over down at the carriers. So he's going to fly. This Buffalo is going to fly up against this 0. And the Buffalo needs a 6. The 0 needs a 5 or 6. So we'll start with the Buffalo. He gets a 2, and the 0 gets a 5. So the Buffalo has been shot out of the sky. And then the 0, we can kind of return him to home. Now, since he's gone, I have to pull a no fighters. They say pull it out of the cup. So I'm just going to pull one here. There's a no fighter. We'll put this back in the cup. Okay, now these guys can make their bombing run. And I'm going to assume there's only one anti-aircraft fire here. So I'm going to fire with a 1 to 6, and I need a 5 or 6. I get a 3. Now, a 3 to 4 means that they abort their attack. So these guys are going to head back home. I think that's a 3 to 4. Bomb run, aircraft, fighter. Oh, no, 5 or 6. That's just an abort. Okay, they don't shoot them down. So I needed a 5 or 6 to get that guy out of there. Okay, that's fine. So we have all 4 of these going against Midway. And then they're going to need a 6 to hit Midway. So I roll it 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nothing. Okay, so they're going to fly home. And that is the end of the Japanese portion. I need to turn everybody. Rotate it and rotate. And, okay, now then the Japanese would know where the U.S. is. The U.S. needs to roll, and they get a 3, so nothing there. So we go to the next turn. It's now 0630, and the Japanese are going to go up against the carriers. These guys are going to have to either land or ditch, and these zeros, they really need to take off to start protecting, but they're not going to be able to. So I'm going to land. And we're going to get these guys prepped. So they land and prep for the next turn. And then we're going to go against we're going to go ahead and fight against the U.S. carriers. So we pull a fleet token and we find the Yorktown. Now we take the no carrier, put it back in the fleet, and pull again. And we find the Enterprise, and we pull again, and we find the Hornet. So the no fleet token didn't do anything. So we can pull it out of the game. So we know where all 3 carriers are. Puts us at a big advantage. Now, the fighters, we pull a fighter, and we get no fighter. This makes it very bad for the U.S. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just roll this and show you what would normally happen. So if and then we'll go back and I'll play it with a fighter. Let's see. So these 2 are going to fight against the anti-aircraft. On a 5 or 6, we send them home. 1 home. So nothing there on the Enterprise. We try for the Yorktown. So there's 1 there, Kate, and a 5 here. Okay. Now in this case, there was no combat air patrol protecting the Enterprise, so you simply roll 2 die and count up the pips. And that's how many hits it takes. And now this is not 4 hits. This is only 2 hits on each one. So basically this guy's eliminated. Here you would have 1 die, and if they rolled a 1, that would turn him over. And here 1 die would roll a 3, and that would eliminate him. So normally the Enterprise would be gone, sunk, and the Hornet would be sunk. And that would leave the Yorktown to go. Let's put these guys back, and let's pull and see if there's a fighter. Because without that CAP, pretty much the game's over. I don't want that short of a game for you. So we'll put that back in. Okay, so there's a Buffalo. There's no fighter. Okay, so the Buffalo's actually going to fight the 0. And we roll again to see, and the Buffalo needs a 6 and gets it, so the 0 is shot down. Now the 0 needs a 5 or 6, so it does not shoot down the Buffalo. So we remove the 0 from the game. And then the Buffalo is going to go up here 3 ahead. 1, 2, 3. Okay, and we don't need to pull a no fighter. Now we can see if we get through. And we're just going to go 2 with each. Like I said, I kind of wanted to show you what would happen there. If you don't have combat air patrol flying, things get kind of bad really fast. Oh, these guys landed. Okay. So I was going to say, could I take those 0s? I can't. Now then, we do anti-aircraft fire, and a 1 doesn't do anything. A 2 doesn't do anything. And a 4 doesn't do anything. So now we can roll to see if we get a 5 or 6, then that's going to do a point of damage. So we'll start with these 2 Kates against the Enterprise. And I get a 5 and a 6. So that is enough to send it reverse 1 and reverse 2, and he's gone. Okay. We'll pull these aside. Here we need, on the Yorktown, I need a 5 or 6, and I get a 6 and a 2. So he takes a point of damage. And these guys are gone. And then here, a 5 and a 3, so he takes a point of damage. Okay. So, yeah, the Japanese have done a pretty thorough job of destroying the Americans. Okay, we can rotate these guys. And I think that's the end of turn, because these guys flew in. Yeah. So by turn 3... yeah, I think we're good. Okay, we move to turn 4. It's 0730. And these guys are prepping to fly out. These 2 0s. Oh, we can't fly out. Because I want to land these guys. So the 0s are just going to have to sit there and wait. And then I'm going to land these guys. Okay, and then I'm going to turn them. Okay, that's it. Now then, the Americans get to go, and we roll. We need a 5 or 6, and we get a 5. So that means the Americans can get through. The Japanese are they're in a kind of a bad situation because they have no cap. So, but luckily when I pulled the bombers, no bomber. So that goes ahead 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, now then the Japanese can fly. We go to the next turn. And this no fighter can go back here in the fighter pool. And we can send these guys out. Question is, do I want to try to hit Midway or sink carriers? I think I'm going to go ahead and put everything into sinking carriers. 1, 2, 3. We'll send a lone plane to Midway. We'll send a 0 with them, and we'll send a 0 here. Oh, we got 2 zeros I can do, I think. Okay. Now these guys have landed. Okay, now I can turn everybody. Rotate. Rotate. And rotate. And I want these three to be Kate's. And this will be a Val. Okay, so Val's going to go over there. Kate's are going to go there. And that is the U.S. turn. Or, I mean, that's the Japanese turn. Now the U.S. can go. And they send a bomber. And a bomber. No bomber. Okay. And are they accompanied by a fighter? Yes, they're accompanied by a fighter. And no fighter. Okay, so first of all, the bomber is up against the 2 zeros. So the buffalo's against the zeros, and the buffalo's going to roll a 5, misses. The zeros roll a 0 can go against it. I'm sorry, the zero's going to go 1 against the buffalo, 1 against the Avenger. Okay, so let's go against the 0. Or the 0 against the buffalo, nothing. Okay. So we can send him 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He goes back. And now this Avenger, the 0 is going to go against Avenger. And we get a 3. Now, a 3 means it's aborted. So he goes back. And these 2 zeros sit down here. That ends the American turn. And we go to 0930. At this point, we can put him back in the fighters. And now the Japanese can make their attacks. So we'll send, let's see what we have for fighters. No fighter. Oh, that's bad. Now I won't do a redo on this one. We'll just go ahead and play it out like it would really play out. So we've got 0s and 3 Kates. I'll put 2 Kates on Yorktown and 1 Kate on the Hornet. And there's no CAP. So we do anti-aircraft, first of all. And we get a 6. So 1 guy aborts. And then over here on the Hornet, we do a 4. So nothing there. So now they get to roll. And this Kate against the Yorktown gets a 6. And that is enough to hit the Yorktown. And so the Yorktown is flipped to nothing. So it's gone. Okay. And then the Kate is going to go against the Hornet and rolls a 4. So they would need it a 5 or no, there's no cap. So 4 would be enough to this. They have basically 1 hit point and they're now going to be at 0. So they're sunk to the bottom. And then this Val here, I still get to use the fighters. No fighter. 1, 2, 3. The Val's going to try, or the Buffalo's going to fight against the Val and gets a 2. So the Val gets through. He would have needed a 3, 4, 5, or 6, and then anti-aircraft a 6. So he's sent back. So no attacks on Midway. And basically that has sank all of the carriers. I guess we could go through and see if we get Midway. I think we can keep 3 fighters or bombers. It's kind of hard to tell here. What's left? No bombers. Yeah, the rules aren't real clear on this. Oh my gosh, I didn't know there's so many bombers. Okay, so we'll do 1 Buffalo and 2 Avengers. And we'll put a no bomber. I guess we'll just put a no bomber, no fighter in here. Actually, the bombers won't matter because without carriers, they can't really do anything. Turns are simultaneous. I guess even though they're sunk, the U.S. could still send a bomber out. So let's make the bomber run, the final bomber run, just to see what points are going to be. Yeah, the rules are a little sparse on this game. I'm not sure. There could be just a few improvements. And I tried to make them clearer when I did my thing. So okay, no fighter. Let's pull bombers. 1. No bomber, so nothing against them. We go to 1030, and These guys would come home. And then that would be the turn. Everybody flies back. We go here to 11:30, and basically I would have Kates going out. Every Kate that I have, I really don't need any zeros going out. And actually, these aren't Kates. I'm sorry, they're vowels. Flip them to vowels. And then we would go to 12:30 when they make their final attack on Midway. And we pull a buffalo and no fighter. Okay, so buffalo would fire, gets a 4, sends this guy back. And we goes 1, 2, 3. And then they could make their bombing run. And they get a 4, so there's no anti-aircraft fire. And then we roll a 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. Nothing, so they would come home. You know, at the same time, we could send out more. I don't know. Let's just end it there, because eventually they're going to try to get Midway. They may be able to just roll, but I think we've made the point that with 3 carriers sank to the bottom that we're pretty much done for the game. Let me figure up some points here, and I'll let you know how it comes out. Okay, after checking scoring here, it's pretty easy. You're going to do 2 points for each carrier that's sunk. So essentially this is going to be a Japanese major victory. Assuming this would have pretty much played out the Japanese plan. They would have been able to sink the entire U.S. carrier force, and at this point the Pacific would pretty much belong to the Imperial Japanese Navy. Anyway, that's what I've got. This is not a bad game. I think it's got some kind of cool things. There's certainly some room for improvement, and the rules could have been just a little bit better. But then again, I also understand, they were translated from German to English, so that always, whenever you have that language translation, it always makes a few minor things that can be kind of confusing to the non-native speaker. But all in all, I think there's that the designer did do a good job of making something unique with this, and I kind of wish he would make more games like this, because I think there's some kind of cool little things, particularly for the rare solitaire games that are out there. Anyway, like I say, that's what I've got this week. I appreciate you guys watching. If you are the designer of this game, I appreciate the work you did on this game, and we will talk to you guys later. Bye.